Most of the time I try to entertain with my post covers, but once in a while I get an uncontrollable urge to say something serious. Like everyone else, I'm concerned with the world situation, and like everyone else, I like to contribute something to help. The only way I can help is through my pictures. So for a long time, I've been trying to think of a subject that might be of some help. Then one day it came to me. I suddenly got an idea, the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, was the subject I was looking for. Looking back at the moment, I'm not entirely sure of why or how the idea got into my head. But I guess if I think about it, throughout my life, having traveled the world, everywhere I went, people were so welcoming to me and my family. That warmth and hospitality always stuck with me, and it reflected how I wanted to treat everyone in return. In my research, I've been reading up on comparative religion. The thing is that all major religions have the golden rule in common. Not always the same words, but the same meaning. Initially, I made all sorts of sketches. It wasn't easy. Visualizing an abstract concept like the golden rule isn't easy. Then I remembered that down in the cellar of my studio was this 10-foot-long charcoal drawing of my United Nations picture, which I started in 1953, but never finished. It was going to be a mass of people representing the people of the world, waiting for the delegates of the UN to straighten out the world so that they may live in peace and without fear. I never finished the picture, not because I lost faith in the UN, but because I lost confidence in my ability to express what I wanted to say in the picture. However, when I looked at it again, nearly 8 years later, I immediately felt that the grouping of the peoples of the world behind the delegates was the basis of my picture, illustrating the golden rule. First, I had a picture taken of the charcoal. Then I cut out some of the figures and arranged them on a piece of cardboard to see if the idea was viable. It was amazing how everything just seemed to fall into place. Two mothers holding their children seemed to express exactly what I was trying to say about the golden rule. Using them as the basis of my composition, I introduced new characters. Of the 28 heads in the finished painting, 8 were taken from the UN charcoal. As for the inspiration for the other 20 people in the image, I look back at some of the photographs I took on my 1955 around the world Pan Am trip. They reference native costumes and accessories and how they were worn. In fact, I picked up a few of those costumes and brought them back to the studio. What I did not have for costumes, we devised from ordinary objects in my studio, such as a lampshade used as a fez. When I started the United Nations picture, I was living in Arlington, Vermont, and when I finished the Golden Rule, I was living in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. Surprisingly enough, many of my models were local exchange students and visitors. That man there, he is part Brazilian, part Hungarian. Then there is Choi, a Korean. He's a student going to Ohio State University. Here is a Japanese student at Bennington College. Here is a Jewish student. He was taking a summer school course at the Indian Hill Museum School, right up the road a piece. Ironically, the rabbi, well, he is a retired postmaster in Stockbridge. He made a pretty good rabbi. In real life, he's a devout Catholic. I got all of my Middle Eastern faces from Adela, who runs the Elm Street Market, just 1 block from my house. This girl is a local girl who lives in Pittsfield, about 15 miles away from Stockbridge. This little girl lives in Stockbridge, just down the road. This person up here, she's from memory. She's my wife, Mary. She passed away a couple years ago. She's holding my grandson. Although she never got to meet him, she gets to, in a way, in this picture. I completed the first version of the preliminary drawing in wolf pencil on August 19, 1960. On September 3rd, however, I revised the drawing to include people of every race, creed, and color, depicting them with dignity and respect. This here is the final version of the drawing I completed on September 28th. Although I had not solved all the problems, I felt I should start the painting. September 30th, the first day's work on the painting. I was laying in the heads roughly. A painting always progresses rapidly while I am laying it in roughly. You see the golden rule lettering? That is lettered in on a cellophane overlay. It did not get painted on until the picture was finished. The painting progresses more slowly now. I am working out the subtle relationships of color and tone. I'm still making changes in an attempt to tell the story more clearly with great impact. Each head must have a character of its own and yet contribute to the overall conception. I finished the painting on January 8, 1961. After I completed painting all the people, I hired a man by the name of Joseph Jenny to paint the lettering of the words of the Golden Rule. He was a draftsman at General Electric who specialized in lettering work and quite an accomplished painter in his own right. I spent almost 5 months painting this picture. It was an enormous amount of work, a lot more time than I typically would invest in a painting. But I never got discouraged about it. And right or wrong, I never stopped thinking that it was worthwhile. In the end, it achieved what I set out to do.
I remember my mother coming to school to meet my sister and I and walk us home. She was pushing the stroller with my little brother in it. She never came to pick us up after school to walk us home, so that was a little unusual. But we're walking along and she said, "How would you feel about moving to America?" Well, I was immediately excited by that prospect because in my big book of science, there was an illustration of the Empire State Building. It looked unbelievably big and made the skyline below look really small. Although the image was exaggerated to fill the page more effectively, I always had it in my mind that America was home to this gigantic building, biggest in the world. I thought, I'll get to see it when? Are we really doing this? My father was a textile technician in a small mill town in England. It was called Bolton. He worked with, rebuilt, and maintained knitting machines, these high-speed, highly complicated knitting machines that had been developed, a particular kind, in England during the Second World War. And they were knitting nylon and things of that nature, making a 14-foot wide beam of stretched fabric. American businessmen from New Jersey came to visit the company where my father worked in the Nottingham area and recognized that this guy who was working with these machines was the guy they would need to actually run a similar machine and eventually the entire knitting plant in the United States. To get ready for our trip, each of the children in the family had to choose 3 books, because we could only take 3 books each to fit into the 2 trunks that we had that would carry all our earthly belongings to our new home. For me, they were the Big Book of Science for Boys and Girls, Ned the Lonely Donkey, and Robinson Crusoe, the last of which was an ironic book choice when you're about to travel across the Atlantic Ocean on a ship. The thing about the Big Book of Science for Boys and Girls is that every spread, and it was done in spreads, one spread was geology, one spread was sound, one spread was nature, space, and stuff like that. One spread had the biggest and fastest things in the world. That was the Empire State Building spread. Everything I needed to know in my childhood really was contained in that book. Finally, in the summer of 1957, my father started off to begin his job and to find us a place to live in New Jersey. So we flew. Smart guy. My mother, on the other hand, with the steamer trunks and 3 kids, got the job of bringing everyone over by ship. One of life's ironies is that the ship depicted in the Big Book of Science alongside the Empire State Building was the SS United States, the very ship we would take to America. At the dock, standing in front of us and stretching out of sight in both directions, was the towering black and white wall of the ship. It was the biggest thing I had ever seen. A carpet ended at the bottom of a steep ramp where a ship's photographer took one of only 2 pictures that could prove we were ever on the ship. At the top of the ramp, a bellboy led us to a staircase. We followed him down to Deck B, the tourist class of the ship, and to a corridor lined with doors. On the way, he pointed out the toilets, which we were familiar with, and something else called a shower, which we were not. On our tickets, our cabin was called a stateroom, but in reality, it was a very small room with only bunks and a porthole. Lunch on the ship was served promptly at 12:15. Our table was number 24 in the dining saloon. Sausage was the most familiar item on the menu. That's when I first met bologna and salami. After lunch, we would climb the stairs to the promenade deck to get some fresh air. As the ship gently rocked, we would hold onto the railing and look out at the horizon. My mother and youngest brother then would go back inside, back to our stateroom. What my mother never told us till much, much later was that she suffered from seasickness every day of that trip to America. My sister and I spent much of our trip exploring the tourist class, which entailed standing on deck and looking at the horizon, and going to the movie theater, where we watched the movies Walt Disney's Perry and The Pajama Game repeatedly for free. Although they were the same movies repeated over and over, we came from a place where going to the movies in England was a once-in-a-year treat. Seeing movies each day of the trip, albeit the same ones over and over, was a treat beyond imagination. Every morning, I would wake up and look out the porthole of our cabin, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Empire State Building. It was all I could think about. When not watching movies and not looking at the horizon, I would sit on the promenade deck and stare pathetically at the windows of the bridge, hoping for an invitation from the captain to go up and try my hand at the wheel of the ship. But the invitation never came. The only difference between the days was that each day felt longer than the day before. While this was mostly due to the impatient mind of a 10-year-old boy, it turns out that each night, while we slept, the ship's clocks were turned back an hour to accommodate for a new time zone we were entering on our passage west across the ocean. This was done to prepare passengers for the New York time, but for a seasick mother and her 3 children, it was a form of torture. The last night on the ship was gala night. While the menu for this special occasion was elevated beyond sausage, with the likes of foie gras, mushrooms à la française, queen olives, and gaspé salmon au four, I settled on ice cream and chocolate sauce. On this occasion, the second photograph commemorating our trip was taken. At 6 a.m. on the last morning, I went out on deck, and instead of seeing the vast expanse of the ocean, I saw the fog-encased view of an approaching coastline. Unbeknownst to me, on that same morning, the man who built the ship I was traveling on, William Francis Gibbs, was driven to the Brooklyn shoreline to welcome home his creation. It was a ritual he rarely missed. At first, there was no sign of the tallest building in the world. The first skyscrapers of Manhattan we saw were those overlooking the Battery. It wasn't until we turned up the Hudson River that I finally saw it. I wasn't disappointed. I was devastated. It was nowhere near as big as I'd been promised by that illustration in the Big Book of Science. The book I treasured, the book I trusted, the book I personally selected for precious trunk space. Gradually afterward, life settled into a pattern of new routines and occasional surprises. My walk to school took me over a railroad crossing, and on one particularly clear day, I saw in the distance the unmistakable silhouette of the Empire State Building. Then, one night, as I walked home from Boy Scouts across those same tracks, I noticed a flashing light and realized it must be coming from the top of the building. Any lingering disappointment about our first encounter instantly vanished. And in its place came a reassuring feeling I can still remember over 60 years later. The tallest building in the world, having lured me across the Atlantic Ocean under false pretenses, was keeping an eye on me day and night as this foreign land became my home.
My family and I are Cambodian refugees. We came over we came to Pittsfield in the fall of 1979, but we have been in the States since August of 1979. We lived during the time period of what's known as the Killing Fields, and miraculously, after 4 years of living in labor camps and concentration camp-like settings, we all escaped together. There were 11 of us, 6 kids. I was the youngest of 6. My mom, dad, aunt, uncle, and my grandmother. And so my oldest siblings, one brother and one sister, lived in a forced labor camp away from our family that whole time. And my grandmother, whose ring I have, used to walk back and forth from our camp to their camp to just check in on them and to make sure that they're okay. On several occasions, she was threatened that they were going to kill her, but she said, you'll have to kill me because I'm going to see my grandchildren. A few times, my siblings, my sister in particular, was passed out, naked, beaten, and at one time she had malaria, so they let her bring her home because they said she was going to die anyway, so just take her home. And my grandmother got her, nursed her back to health, and then she had to return her. So anyways, one night, when the Khmer Rouge their regime was coming to an end, my family decided that we were going to run and get to the Thailand border. So we were able to get the news to my siblings, and we all rendezvoused at a spot. It was a miracle, really. And we all walked from Cambodia to Thailand. It took us several days, and we finally made it to the Thailand border where there was a refugee camp, and that's where we stayed for a few months until we were able to get sponsorship to the United States.
My American story, I guess, begins with my grandfather, Meyer Franklin, and he came to the United States from Eastern Europe, specifically Lithuania, near a town called Druskinkai. And he was 16 years old when he came over. But the reason he came over, fleeing persecution, my grandfather was very Orthodox, an Orthodox Jew, and in Eastern Europe, Jewish people lived in villages called shtetls. Russian government would have state-sponsored soldiers or groups come in, and they'd rape and they'd pillage these villages. And they'd try to find out if there were any valuables at all, whoever owned various valuables in their households, such as, for example, Kiddush cups, which might have some silver in them. My grandfather found out who some of these informants were. Some Jewish families thought that the best way to protect their own family was to inform the government who might have these valuables. And these informants obviously were not looked upon very kindly by the Jewish residents, because these people are living within their midst, and they're traitors. They're betraying them. So, from what I hear from my uncles and my father, who's passed away, they told me that a warning was given to this particular informant and he wouldn't stop giving information about who owned particular valuables. So my grandfather, and I don't know how he did it, at 16 years old, somehow obtained a pistol or a gun. And after warnings, I think the story goes, I guess he shot this particular informant. And then my great-grandfather had to get him out of the country, and they smuggled him in a hay wagon to the nearest port. And he made it out, and somehow he managed to sponsor his family coming over here. The great-grandfather came, but many of his brothers and sisters were killed in the Holocaust, the ones that remained. But he did get his mother and father here as well.
My grandfather came to America from occupied Poland in 1911. He and my grandmother had gotten married in Poland, but to make the trip easier for the rest of the family, he came here first to find work and to find a home. He got work as a pocket maker in a New York City garment factory, and that's when he noticed that things weren't fair, that people had to work in sweatshops or had to work 70 to 80-hour work weeks and still didn't have a living wage. So his union, he really loved his union, and he was very dedicated to it. It was called the Amalgamated. It was a mix of people from different countries and people in different parts of the clothing line. They fought for a living wage and limited hours. I think first, in 1914, they got the work week down to 50 hours, and later they worked to lower it even more. Eventually, my grandmother came over from Poland, and my grandparents became citizens in 1917. They were really happy to be citizens, at the same time as they held on to some of their traditions. They had all these social groups that they belonged to. It was modern in a lot of ways, but still different from the America that they were living in. So it was a matter of them fitting in some ways and not fitting in others, and having these kids who were all American. Now, my grandfather, who was an advocate for freedom in the workplace, was really a dictator in his home life. He didn't allow toys. He locked them up. Everything was hidden. His son, my uncle, was rebellious. He found his roller skates one time and took them out to play. He broke his arm, that first time out using them, and then was worried about coming home. For a time, he pretended that he did not hurt himself to avoid incurring the wrath of his father. For my mother, she let a doll go out the trolley car window. It was made of paper, but my grandfather convinced her that she was too old to have it. And the oldest daughter, Lillian, was taught not to walk on the other side of the street, on the sidewalk with her friends, which my grandfather thought was very bad manners. She inevitably lost all her friends. They had that kind of childhood. And yet, my grandfather also wanted the family to be together all the time. He welcomed everybody into the house. There were constant drop-in visitors. There were constant parties going on. That was how he wanted his life to be. I mean, I don't really understand it, but that was what went on there. A lot of the family lived in these 4 crowded apartments in the same building, with this beautiful exterior and very cramped interior. He squashed so many people into a tiny bungalow, and everywhere you looked was another place for a foldable bed. It was just packed through and through. The neighbors, on the other hand, were not so overjoyed with our family. There were always open doorways, because my grandfather took the hinges off all the doors. Anything that happened to anyone, the story got around the whole house in 2 seconds. My grandmother was the only observant, somewhat religious Jew in our entire family. She used to bake. She baked challah, and we'd smell it in the hallway when we came into the house. For me, there will always be an association of food and her, particularly the smell of bread. And yet, there was tolerance in the family too. My aunt would often cook bacon, and we would all go downstairs to her apartment for some bacon. As I got older, we would often go out for ice cream. I would always associate ice cream with insects, because whenever we went out for ice cream at night at the shop nearby, the windows of the store would always be filled with insects. Not a lot, but for a young kid, it seemed like a lot more than there really were. Speaking of insects, near my grandfather's bungalow, they sprayed DDT every week, and to show off, my cousin and his friends would ride their bicycles into the DDT, because it looked cool. That was how we lived. These are the stories that I've heard for years, some of which are ridiculous, but the combination of what's sad, what's really funny, and what's just very weird about your own family. That's what this is all about, getting the stories.
Me and my parents were living in Mexico, and my dad worked as a police officer over there. And my grandma, she actually came here like 2 times, and she went back and told us how she practically convinced my mom that coming here would be a place of opportunity for us to have like a better lifestyle than we had back then. My dad actually crossed the desert by himself, and my mom, my grandma, and me, we came here safer than he did. And when we got here, it was like 2 weeks to get a hold of my dad. We didn't know if he was okay. He was supposed to get there a week after we got there, but the week passed and we had no idea where he was. So then we waited another week until he finally arrived. But so since I was brought here at the age of 6, I obviously didn't come here legally, and so at the age 15, we started looking for a lawyer to see if I could apply for DACA, and they said that I had to wait until I was 16 so I could go through the process and everything, because it takes like 2 years or so. So when I was like in high school, I just like never thought that I would go to college, because I was like, I'm illegal, like they're not gonna accept me whatsoever. I can't like, it was like as if they clipped my wings. Like I wanted to be like nurse or something big to like keep my family stable too. So DACA, like they basically call us the dreamers. Our parents are the real dreamers. We are the doers. Not just anyone crosses the border just to come for a better future for their daughter.
So I like to, I think, start my story from where my ancestors started, particularly my birth parents both. They were both born in Syria, and my father left Syria, I think, in the early 60s. I think he fled Syria as a young man on a boat, and eventually ended up in Düsseldorf in Germany, where he had a friend. About 20 years later, he was introduced to my mother, my birth mother, in Syria, in Damascus. They thought they would be a good match, so they were sent on a blind date, and my mother took the chance to meet a man who would bring her to Germany, to the promised land. And so they got married in Damascus at a Armenian Christian church. And they moved to Germany, and that's where my older sister was born, and I myself was born in Germany. Plus, 10 years later, my 4 little half-siblings were born there. So I was born in Germany, and I hadn't been back to Syria until, well, the last time was when I was 3 or 4, and then until I turned 19, I hadn't went back to Syria because I didn't want to. I felt like there was nothing that I needed, nothing I was missing. So I went back and I realized, oh, I was missing a lot, and it was a really intense experience. I was there for 2 weeks, and I was crying one day, and I was like super happy the next day, and crying again the next day. And it took another few years until I went back the next time that I really fell back in love with my roots and my country and my family there. All my whole family was in Syria. And that was in January 2011. That was 3 months before the war started. So I haven't been back since then. In 2015, I decided I wanted to spend the summer somewhere else, and I picked the Berkshires. And so I spent 3 months in the Berkshires, and that's where I met my now husband. So I fell in love with the Berkshires, but I especially fell in love with my husband. And so we started dating for 4 weeks. I went back to Germany, and a week later I called him and I said that I would move to the States for him if he would like me to. And I still remember his face and his eyes, how they exploded. And he said, it was on Skype, and he was like, I would like that very much. And so 3 months later I came back and I stayed.
My grandparents were Protestant missionaries that went out to China in the 1860s. They were part of something called the China Inland Mission, which was a huge multi-denominational Protestant missionary conglomerate from England. I guess you could call it very powerful. At the time they went, there had been a famine because of huge flooding, and people were really suffering. A lot of the families that couldn't feed their whole family were leaving their girl babies to die in this cemetery, in the cemetery tower. My grandmother, when she became aware of this, began to go to the cemetery whenever an infant was left and take it back home. She organized wet nurses for the kids. They saved these babies. They had some help from a China Inland Mission, and they built an orphanage, a building for the kids. My father, their son, was raised in Shefu and spoke several dialects of Chinese, and loved the Chinese and loved the culture. Growing up, he wanted to be a musician, and so he went to Canada, to the University of British Columbia, to study music. While he was there, he met my mother. He wanted to marry her, and so he took her back to China. He never became a musician, but he ended up working for the James McMullan Company to support us. By the time I was born, it was a fairly good life, and the company was doing very well. Shefu, at that point, was going through a pretty good economic period where everyone was doing pretty well. Of course, once the Japanese came in 1937, it started to slow down and change. For a time, we hung on, but the rule under the Japanese became increasingly oppressive, just like some of the Jewish families in Europe that couldn't believe that this solid life they had created could really be decimated by this other force. During this time, my father joined the British Army in Shanghai. My mother and I and my sister were very lucky to get out of China when we did. Actually, by the time we left Shefu, we had to get the Japanese Army's permission to leave the city. At first, they didn't want my father to leave the city because he was of military age. He convinced them that he was just seeing us off to Shanghai and he would return, which is the reason that we didn't get anything out of Shanghai, that we had to leave everything behind in order to substantiate the story that my father was going to return. We just got out of there by the nick of our teeth. Other family members attempted to leave later, and they eventually became prisoners of war. We went from Shanghai to San Francisco, and then from San Francisco to Canada, and various places in Canada during the war, going from pillar to post. First, living with my grandparents in a little town in the interior of British Columbia, and then living with my aunt and uncle and cousin on this island called Salt Spring Island, which is off the coast of Vancouver. We lived there for almost a year. That was a very happy time, because it was the first stability since leaving China that we were a family again. Then, My father arranged for us to go on a boat from New York to go to India, and that he would join us in India, and then my mother would go with him to China, because at that point, he was the military attaché at the British Embassy, which was actually just a cover for the fact that he was basically in spy work, but he needed an official category. He had been training. Because he spoke so many dialects of Chinese, they trained him to train Chinese guerrilla troops how to blow up bridges, basically, and railroad tracks, and various kinds of demolition. Anyway, we took the ship from New York to Bombay, and in the course of the trip, a plane dropped a flare over the ship, which was the usual preamble to bombing a ship. Then the plane turned out to be an American plane. There had been confusion. The pilot of the plane thought it was a German ship. Finally, they made radio contact, or somehow or other, they got it straightened out that we were not a German ship, and so he didn't bomb us. We were getting into the lifeboats by the time this all had gotten straightened out. This was a very difficult moment, to say the least. I lived the remaining time of the war in Darjeeling, going to boarding school, but my mother went on to China to live with my father. At the end of the war, my father got killed. He was flying to a prisoner of war camp to help the British people, civilians that were at the camp, to organize themselves to leave the camp. The plane he was on for one of these trips ran into an electrical storm and went into a mountain. Obviously, that was really hard on my mother, because she'd had all of these anxious months living in China where he was out of contact, working behind the lines with the Chinese troops, and not knowing if he was dead or alive, and then surviving all of that, only to die once the war was over. Afterwards, we lived for a year in Shanghai. Then we got on a ship and returned to Canada through San Francisco again. I had just turned 11 by the time all of that had ended. It's basically the first 10.5 years of my life. I realized that these events were the touchstones of a lot of my anxieties and what made my personality the way it is, which is basically the personality of someone that stands to the side and watches, rather than someone that plunges in, as it were. The good news about that is that I think that's the basis of the fact of why I love drawing so much, that it's the natural outcome of watching and thinking about people and how they live.
I'm here right now sitting in this room at Berkshire Community College looking out at this incredible view with these gorgeous fall trees, and I'm like, that's what home means to me. You know, nature, family, connection, a sense of stillness and contentment inside. I'm an artist, so I always have a restless energy, but being somewhere like the Berkshires is very calming for my spirit. Being around folks who both challenge me and comfort me, that I feel deep emotional connections with. Having meaningful conversations about life, love, and the pursuit of happiness and hopes and dreams and fears. And knowing that I have this incredible family in Canada and around the world that care so deeply about how I'm doing, and I care so deeply about how they're doing. That's what home means to me.
I suppose home to me is about people. It's about a feeling of security and community. And a connection through people to a past and a set of values that we carry forward and then teach to in my case, my children, but to the next generation. And as an educator, values that we want to instill to the next generation.
We moved to the Berkshires when my daughter, who is turning 21, was 1 month old. So this was home. This is where I became an adult. This is where I was a mother. This is where I experienced the most important chapter of my life. And I was very comfortable at home. And then there was an election that shattered the links and the bonds that existed among people who didn't necessarily agree on everything, especially politically. And that was an incredible thing that I didn't even think I would ever experience in my life. But the rupture, the schism, was so violent and so abrupt and so in your face and so painful that it made me sick. It made me sick. It made me very sad. And there were people who all of a sudden would point their finger at my face. And I'm not speaking figuratively, I'm speaking literally. And remind me that if me and my people didn't want to follow the rules, or if me and my people didn't want to be here, we better get out. And I thought, well, wasn't I part of you? Wasn't I part of your people? Don't I work for you? Because as much as I work for the immigrant community is less than 11% of our student body, of the people who live in Berkshire County. So I also work for the 90-something% or 89% of the people, and I serve them with the same care and passion as I serve the immigrant community, because I do see a human being as a human being. So that was very painful for me and very difficult, and seeing my parents get older in another country and aging and having some health issues and feeling a rejection and anger on my own personal part, I left. I left the Berkshires. And I didn't know where home was. I lost my home. And I lived in Mexico, I was physically in the country where I had been born, where I'd been raised, where my family was, but it wasn't home. It wasn't the people that I work with, that I go to church with, that help me raise my children, that agree with me philosophically in widening the table. But it was also very reassuring that this is my home. And some people might not like it, and some people might have issues with it, and I want to welcome them to the same table where I'm sitting at, so they can see me as their neighbor, because I am. And I fight and I work and I live for the same ideals that they do. I might have an accent, but in the core, we are all seeking the same thing. So what is home for me? It's this place.
I dreamed of you. Then you appeared. Together, we became amour. Love. Amour. Resplendent life, you and I. One day, we bundled our gifts in our backpack and crossed a bridge outstretched like the universe. Adios, corazon. And when we made it, to the other side, thirsty, in awe, unable to go back, we became immigrants. When I first came to the United States, I felt like I came with nothing. I crossed a bridge from Ciudad Juarez into El Paso, and I actually had nothing with me. I only had a baby in my hands. But through the years, I realized that that narrative was not a true narrative. That for me to keep saying that I came with nothing was not real, was not true. I started realizing that I had actually come with a lot of things that you don't necessarily see, at least not right away. We bring everything of who we are. In my story, I decided to include a backpack of the things that I learned and I understand now that I grew up with. They are all symbolic. There is a flower, and that's an orchid, which represents the forest of the place where I came from, the city of Jalapa. There are clouds with the rain, because I come from a place where it rains almost every day. There is a skeleton, and for me the skeleton is the playful representation of life, the joy of being alive. I include a volcano, which represents the mission and the passion that I know grew up within me. There is a dog, and that represents a companion in life. And for everyone, we are always accompanied by stories, and also by our ancestors. There is a heart with an eye. To me, that represents my intuition and my unique way of seeing things. There is also a leaf, and to me that's a leaf that comes from a lemon tree, like my grandmother used to have in her backyard, and it represents the power, knowledge, and wisdom that we have from nature to heal. There is also a pencil, and that pencil, of course, represents the creativity and whatever talent I might have had with me when I came to the United States. There is also a star, there is also a moon, there is also a sun. They represent all the sunshine, color, and the light that I know I brought with me. Much how like people are immigrants, so are animals. For me, the monarch butterfly represents immigrants coming from Mexico into the United States. Monarchs come into central Mexico during the cold months of the year, and when it gets warmer, they go to the United States and into Canada. The migration of this animal is truly amazing. Monarch butterflies live for only a short period of time, sometimes not more than a month. They will not be able to withstand the long distances that they have to endure when they migrate. So the way they do it is they do it through generations. There is a generation that starts in Mexico and reaches a part of the south of the United States. But then they cannot go any further. So there are new generations that take over and over until they finally make it to the north of the United States and Canada. When they return, there is yet another new generation. This signals how our planet and nature works to create a way of survival. They are a big symbol of life and hope. They are the symbol of life and transformation and learning and reaching great journeys so that we can persevere and take care of our little ones. When we came to America, the sky and the land welcomed us in words unlike those of our ancestors. There were so many things we didn't know, unable to understand, and afraid to speak. We made lots of mistakes. You and I became caminantes. Thousands and thousands of steps we took around this land until the day we found a place we had never seen before. Suspicious, improbable, unbelievable, surprising, unimaginable, where we didn't need to speak. We only needed to trust, and we did. Books became our language. Books became our home. Books became our lives. We learned to read, to speak, to write, and to make our voices heard. Someday, we will become something we haven't yet imagined. But right now, we are stories. We are resilience. We are hope. We are dreamers, soñadores of the world. We are love, amor, love.
Yeah, I want to contribute as much as I can to the community. That's all my goal is basically.
In a perfect world, I wish there was less labeling, less trying to place people in some kind of box, and just to see people as an individual and not just a certain group or ethnicity or race.
We are in ourselves, all of us, a melting pot, and I'm afraid that so many people don't realize somewhere way back when, in their own, or maybe not so far back, in their own family history, there is a diversity that they need to embrace. And I think that if you could embrace the diversity in yourself, then you can be more understanding of the people around you. And I think that's, education is huge, opportunity is huge, and if you give people that opportunity, they are going to embrace it and do well, and they're going to contribute tremendously because they have. I mean, the history is the proof of the pudding. You know, I think that we live in silos, and we have to get out of those silos. Walk across the street, you know, take a look, and it's okay to walk across the street. Yeah.
I do believe that we all deserve a second chance, and I don't know, I feel like we should all treat ourselves more kindly and be more understanding of each other, not ignorant, and say things without thinking things through.
Well, having lived through World War II in Belgium and having seen the horrors of war, I think she would hope that we would have learned from that and be more open to other people and she came here, you know, she was, 26 when she came, didn't know the land, didn't know how to speak English. She, you know, very quickly adapted herself to life here in the Berkshires and made many friends. And, you know, she saw the worth and the value of the people who are here. And I think she would look at us today and say, look, you know, tone it down. We need to live together.
I share, you know, what I learned to other people. So sharing is also caring. So, you know, if people start to share like extra thing that, you know, they don't necessarily need, and then they see other people who need those little things, then they should just pass along, you know, instead of like holding on to those unnecessary things. I feel like, you know, maybe, I mean, in the future, what I would do is like if I learn something and if I became rich somehow, then I will start sharing, you know, like probably uneducated people, like, you know, probably give them education and probably support their way to like get their education, like probably housing stuff or food, something that I could be able to contribute.
I would like the future to look like a whole bunch of curious people who are not defensive. I would like the future to look like people who are genuinely curious about people who are not like them and who take the time to build relationships with people who are not like them and who approach everything they do with a deep sense of humanity and compassion, and where people feel a sense of equity, empathy, and belonging in all parts of their life.
Civility for the country, everybody getting along, congeniality. We're a country of immigrants, for immigrants, made by immigrants, and that we have an enlightened immigration policy where everyone can contribute.
A future where there is imaginary frontiers, that there is no walls that separate countries. I think we all should respect each other and we should know our boundaries, but there should not be any walls. There should not be nothing that stops you from moving. The world should be one world, and respect should be like the main thing. As long as we respect and love each other, I think that we could all live together peacefully.
I think that when you grow up and you grow up in an environment where someone went through that you love and know very, very closely, and you know the worst that humanity can be, and that's something that is real and that can happen. That you have a real sense in your own life that you do everything that you do is tied to making sure that never happens again. So I'm think that I'd like to see a future where people are generous to one another, where people work together to protect all life, that we move away from nationalism to seeing people as being people, and that one of the great values that I believe in as an American is that America is at its best is a land where anyone can come and be given real opportunity. And when I say opportunity, I mean real opportunity, where the government and social structures, again, working in education, institutions of education, and especially higher education for me, are creating pathways to successful, robust lives that make not just small families or communities, but the entire society stronger, innovative, peaceful, and harmonious.
To be honest with you, I really want to be more than ever, open and welcoming to not necessarily the immigrant, because I'm already welcoming and open to the immigrant, but to the person who thinks that we are different, who's afraid that we'll take something away, because I know we're not that different. I know that we're looking for the same things, that we appreciate the natural beauty of this place, that we appreciate the freedom that this place gives us, the freedom to leave your car open, right? The freedom to go to a different church. I mean, like we talk about the 4 freedoms, right? The freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, the freedom of want, and the freedom from fear. And I will fight by sitting at the table so you don't fear me and I don't fear you. That's what I'm more focused on anything today. Not to do anything else, but to sit at the table with my neighbor, whether my neighbor sees me eye to eye or not. Because I think at the end of the day, we will. That's my hope for the future. The future that is within 20 minutes from today, you know, like the future that is ongoing, and it's not 10 years down the road, it's the future that we're making every day, every step, every interaction. Because if I don't work on this future today, my tomorrow will be either a wider gap or a closer gap. And so every interaction matters.
It's Baba Israel and Grace Galoo of the band Soul and Scribe rocking with you. Here at the Mahawi, we just did work with young people, realizing that we're all connected more than just equal. Flowing with the rhythm, you can see all the beautiful people. It's like when we freestyle, we rock a spell. Inspired by the imagery from Norman Rockwell. Yeah, see, don't treat anyone as a fool. You gotta understand and connect with the golden rule. Do that research, see, we all hurt, we all feel pain. We all have a soul that we feel with the flame of life and inspiration. That's positive creation. Understand this was done in the time of our nation, where we were still dealing with American apartheid. And so many people cried and too many people died. Injustice, that's why we discuss this. In the 50s it was began, but grew in the 60s and 62. Check out this point of view. Different cultures and religions coming together as one human crew. So do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's the golden rule that we have to pursue. Later on, ironically, Nancy Reagan commissioned it for the UN. But that's a good thing with my pen. I freestyle and then we see it commissioned to a giant mural and repetition with a vision and connection. So I break it down with the rhythm and beat. Used to read a book back in the day when you were young. So now I'll make the beat with the rhythm of the tongue. And you can let the melody feel it because it is sung.
Norman Rockwell means so much to me. I used to read his books when I was growing up with my family in the living room at night. I would make up stories, it would make me feel alright because it reflected my experience. Didn't have 10 cents, had 2 cents, and he represented people like me. Ruby Bridges going to work feeling scary. Going to school, it wasn't cool. Back in the day, you had to say it was violence. Had to be silent, had to be underground. If you were black, it was hard just to get around. But Norman Rockwell, he's black, not white. He's white, not black, but he's keeping it tight. He represents empathy for other people's experience. I know I have my 2 cents when I see this. It makes me feel free, makes me feel peaceful, gives me positivity. I'm hopeful for the future. I'm hopeful for the future. You know that I am hopeful for the future. You know that I am hopeful for the future.
Dig the golden rule.
Some of us came through the desert. Some of us came over the sea. Some of us are escaping from war zones, poverty, and brutality. All of us come here for the promise of liberty. So we gathered our gifts in our backpack. Beautiful life, a beautiful child. Viva el sueño, long live the promise of a better life. Soñadores valientes, soñadores que vemos, soñadores, bienvenidos a casa. Our land of opportunity is built by the dreamers. Our land of opportunity is sustained by the dream. Justice and security is all of ours to claim. So we gathered our gifts in our backpack. Beautiful life, beautiful children, viva el sueño. Long live the promise of a better life. Soñadores valientes, soñadores llevemos, soñadores, bienvenidos a casa. Soñadores valientes, soñadores llevemos, soñadores, bienvenidos a casa. Soñadores, soñadores, soñadores.